Unit 5 will take us more in depth on some topics that we've learned about already, like inflation, unemployment, and stabilization policies when we're in recessionary or inflationary gaps. We're going to learn a new model in Unit 5 called the Phillips curve. Module 30 is all about how the fiscal policy will be used to combat problems like deficits within the budget balance. The budget balance is not just about the federal budget. Federal, state, and local governments all have budgets that they all want to have balanced. And usually people that read the news think that surpluses are good, the government took in more revenue than it spent, and deficits are bad. They're spending more than they're taking in. But this is not always true. I hope you're learning with AP Econ that very few things are just good or just bad. It's usually a little bit more complicated than that. So in this case, surpluses and deficits often go alongside with the business cycle. When you're in an expansion or recovery, that can naturally lead to a surplus, and recessions can create deficits. We're going to talk about some of the automatic reasons why those things occur. So that tells us that, we're going to have some good years and some bad years, but they balance each other out. And if we decide to intervene every single time there's a deficit or a surplus, that can actually be very damaging to the economy. So we're going to see how we don't expect the budget to be balanced every year. But if you've had a deficit for many, many, many years, and now we're in a recovery and there's still a deficit, that's a clue that whatever's happening in the government is not sustainable, and we might need to change that. When we learned the budget balance equation before, we talked about how BB equals taxes minus, etc. But we just wanted to introduce this concept that the budget balance is savings by the government. When we had this equation before, the budget balance was on the savings side of the savings investment spending identity. So if we have a surplus, there would be a positive budget balance because the government is saving money. They're taking in more than they're spending. If we have a deficit, we have a negative budget balance, and the government is not saving, or if you recall that word, dis-saving. So here we have the same equation you've seen before, where budget balance is taxes minus government spending minus transfers. These are all just shortened into a way that's a little bit easier to write, but it's the exact same equation, and you can feel free to write it out fully if you would like. The key idea is that taxes, government spending, and government transfers are all these three parts of fiscal policy. But taxes are the only way that they gain revenue. That one's added. And the other two are expenses, money that leaves the government, and that's why they're subtracted. Let's review how fiscal policy can be used to solve recessionary and inflationary gaps. So first, this picture, we see that we have a recessionary gap. And so fiscal policy shifts which line on this model? Fiscal policy is going to shift AD. So which way does AD need to move to solve the gap? If AD shifts to the right, that would close in our gap. So if AD shifting right, is that going to be expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy? It's expansionary. Expansionary because it's a right shift, and fiscal policy because AD will be the line that is moving to shift to the right. If our goal is expansionary fiscal policy, we need AD to increase. We need it to shift to the right. So think about within our three tools of fiscal policy, taxes, transfers, and government spending, which way would each of those things happen? So first of all, what's going to happen to taxes to make AD increase? If you cut or decrease taxes, people have more disposable income left over, so AD will shift to the right. Now, how about government transfers? If you increase government transfers, that is providing people with more benefits. If they have more benefits, then they have more disposable income at their disposal that they can use to buy other goods. AD would increase. And then finally, the third tool of fiscal policy is government spending. Government spending would increase. This is direct. If the government is spending, they are putting money straight into the economy. They are buying things. If you recall, these first two are indirect. They go into disposable income. And then from that, people will spend some of the money, whereas government spending, all of it gets spent. Now, one more level to this. Do these three things solve the recession? Yes, they all fix the recession. But what would they do to the budget balance? So if this is our equation, budget balance or savings by the government equals T minus G minus TR. If taxes go down, the budget balance decreases. Deficit. If transfers go up, we are subtracting transfers. So subtracting a larger number, budget balance goes down. Deficit. If you increase government spending, same situation. Something that you are subtracting just got larger. The point of this is that all three of these policies will fix the recession. But the problem is, if you decide to use any of these things to intervene and fix the economy, budget balance decreases and you have created a deficit. So if every single time we have a recession you want to do fiscal policy, we're going to make our deficit of our nation worse, substantially worse. Now, if budget balance is decreasing, technically, you could have a giant surplus, and now the surplus got smaller. But either way, we get the idea that the budget balance is decreasing, and that's not good for our economy. Now let's look at using fiscal policy to close an inflationary gap and see what problems it'll solve and what things it might make worse. So we can see that we have an inflationary gap. So fiscal policy will shift AD. Which way do we want AD to move? We want it to move left. So would that be expansionary or contractionary? Our solution is going to be contractionary fiscal policy. Let's go through the options for contractionary fiscal. Contractionary means that AD is shifting which way? To the left, it's decreasing. This is all intended to get us out of our inflationary gap. So what would we do to taxes to make AD decrease? If you raise taxes, that cuts into disposable income. People have less to spend, so aggregate demand will decrease. How about government transfers? If you decrease transfers, people have fewer food stamps, unemployment benefits, veterans benefits. All of those things are government transfers. And if they have fewer benefits, they have less disposable income. They'll need to spend more of their own money. So therefore, their aggregate demand for other products will fall. And finally, government spending will go which way? If you decrease government spending, the government demands goods too and they buy products. And now they'll demand less, so AD will shift left. So these three things will decrease AD, check. They will reverse inflation, they'll get us out of the gap. But all of these things will make the budget balance increase. Taxes add revenue, so that would make it increase. And transfers and government spending take money away from the budget, so when they get smaller, the budget balance increases, which creates a surplus. Now that might sound like, wait, that's a good thing. And for the budget, it is. But think about it from the fiscal point of view. Fiscal is political. This is done by President and Congress. Are any of these things popular politically? If you increase taxes, you're making somebody mad. If you decrease transfers, whose benefits are you going to cut? Are you going to cut Medicare and Medicaid for elderly and low-income individuals? Are you going to cut unemployment benefits and food stamps? Are you going to cut veterans benefits? How about Social Security? There's not really anything that you can cut without making some group upset. And then if you decrease spending, that also can make your constituents mad. Are you cutting funding for schools or roads or VDOT for snow removal? No matter what, cutting spending, there's probably some group that will be upset. So if every single time we have inflation, we decided to use fiscal policy, we would make our gaps smaller, but they are politically unpopular options. In reality, changes in the budget balance are not going to perfectly match up with whatever you're doing in fiscal policy. It's not so simple as raising taxes automatically creates a surplus. One of the reasons why is that of the three tools of fiscal policy, taxes, government spending, and transfers, they don't have equal effects on the budget balance because they don't equally affect the economy. So changing taxes a certain amount and changing transfers a certain amount, even if those dollar amounts are the same, they're not equal in terms of economy-wide impact. Think back to the multiplier, the idea that not everything multiplies as far. Do you remember within taxes, transfers, and government spending, which multiplies further? That's going to be our next slide. Let's look at the differences in the multipliers with some real-world examples. So if government spending is increasing $1,000 and taxes are decreasing $1,000, in terms of our budget balance equation, government spending increasing and taxes decreasing actually cancel each other out because it's the same dollar amount. So therefore, they would equally affect the budget balance. So in terms of deficits and surpluses, we would not see that effect. But there's a difference between the budget balance and the overall effect on real GDP or the economy as a whole. They don't multiply as far. So the original effect of the budget balance doesn't show the multiplier. The total effect on real GDP does. So do you remember which one multiplies further? Government spending multiplies further. Big G. The reason is, if you recall, all of the government spending gets spent in round one. And we can look at our equations here just to review. The spending multiplier, you can do it two ways. 1 divided by 1 minus MPC, or 1 divided by MPS. I like the 1 divided by MPS because it lines up perfectly with the tax multiplier, MPC divided by MPS, because in that case, both situations, MPS is on the bottom. Another way to get the tax multiplier is to find the spending multiplier and subtract 1. So that right away shows you that the spending multiplier is larger if we're going to take 1 away from it and get the tax multiplier. So moral of the story here, you can do multiple things to affect the budget balance, but those changes are not going to equally affect the economy because government spending is direct and changing taxes or transfers are indirect. They don't multiply as far. And just to remind you, if you were trying to figure out the multiplier of transfers, you would use these same equations. Taxes and transfers multiply the same. Spending multiplies more. The other reason why changes in the budget balance don't always perfectly line up with changes in fiscal policy is that sometimes changes in the budget balance are the result, not the cause, of what's going on in the economy. So for example here, a slowdown or a recessionary period of the economy will lead to tax revenue falling. During a recession, people don't buy as much stuff, so sales tax revenues decrease. During a recession, people might be unemployed, So income tax revenues will fall. Now, no one actually changed fiscal policy to intentionally reduce taxes. Recall the difference between discretionary and non-discretionary. If fiscal policy was intentionally changed, that's discretionary. But sometimes these things change automatically. They're called automatic stabilizers. They're going to fluctuate and go up and down with the business cycle, and they will lead to changes in the budget balance, but no one stepped in and did it on purpose. We'll talk more about automatic stabilizers later on in these notes. So we're going to see how the business cycle and the budget balance go hand in hand. So you can see here a simplified version of the business cycle. And we naturally, as I was saying before, can have deficits in recessionary periods because tax revenues are going to fall in recessions. We also are going to spend more money on government transfers, which take money away from the budget balance. So recessions can have automatic causes that lead to deficits. When the business cycle changes and we're going through an expansion or recovery period, tax revenue will start to increase. The amount of money that the government is spending on government transfers will start to decrease as fewer people qualify for all of those benefits, Medicaid, etc. So the deficits get smaller, and they might even become a surplus during those times in the economy. We can see in this historic diagram that the shaded areas are showing us recessions. And we're seeing that the burgundy lines going up and down represent the budget deficit. So during recessionary periods, we have rising deficits. Some of them are higher than others, but we get the general idea. During the Great Recession, we had a spike, a large increase in deficits. As we're going through recovery periods, the deficits are falling. Now, if you notice, this is telling us where zero is. So there are times when the deficits become negative, especially in this section here. So a negative deficit, what do you think that could be? That's a surplus. And you can see that this surplus, we have a little bit of a surplus and some other times. These are all happening during expansion or recovery times. Not only is the budget balance tied to the business cycle, but the business cycle will show us about the unemployment rate. Unemployment is higher in recessionary times. Unemployment is lower during recovery. So because of all of these connections, the budget balance is therefore also linked to the unemployment rate. When we have high unemployment, that tends to lead to deficits in our economy. And when the unemployment rate is lower, the budget deficit will decrease. It could even become a surplus theoretically. And this is all about automatic stabilizers. The idea that both of our tax and transfer system goes along with the business cycle in order to combat high highs and low lows. So when unemployment is high, we know that the income tax revenue will automatically go down. And we know that unemployment benefits, food stamps, Medicaid for low-income individuals, things like that, those transfers will automatically increase when unemployment is going up. And when tax revenues fall and the transfers increase, that's going to create a deficit. So these are the automatic stabilizers that can help with the business cycle, but might not help the budget balance. The budget deficit and unemployment rate are very closely aligned. So we can see here in this table, they're not going to be the exact same percent, but they're going to rise and fall together. And their general changes coincide with what's happening in the business cycle. When deficits and unemployment rates tend to be going up, you can look at that and say that we're in a recessionary period. When both of them are falling, we're in an expansion or recovery period. We keep talking about what these automatic stabilizers are, but now we're going to get it into the notes. So when the budget balance is going into a recession, there's going to be several things that happen automatically. So first of all, tax revenues decline. So you will need to think about some specific taxes. In a recession, the income, the revenue that we would get from sales tax will fall because people and businesses often reduce their spending. If they're afraid of the future, they're afraid of getting fired, they're afraid of their business failing. Income taxes also fall during a recession because unemployment increases, and if fewer people are working or they're working shorter hours, they're going to be paying less in income tax. Now, both of these cases, sales tax and income tax, the government didn't actually consciously lower the tax rates. The tax rates haven't changed at all. But if fewer people are paying the tax, that is a non-discretionary change. It's happening automatically. Also, transfer payments, and this includes welfare, Medicaid, unemployment, food stamps, all of those services that are provided for people who are going through unemployment or going through tough times, will automatically increase during a recession. And again, the government isn't deciding to increase those benefits. The benefits are staying the same. But if more people are qualifying for those benefits because of where their conditions are, that's going to lead to an increase in transfers that are also non-discretionary. The benefit didn't change, there's just more people receiving it. That's why both of these things are considered automatic stabilizers as opposed to some intentional fiscal policy. Now let's look at automatic stabilizers during an inflationary period. This is also called an expansion or a recovery. So during these times, unemployment starts to fall, and people are more optimistic about the future. So when unemployment falls, more people are working, income tax revenues are going to automatically increase. And also, consumer and business optimism starts to rise. So they're going to start spending more money, and that will lead to an increase in sales tax revenue. Again, both of those are non-discretionary. In terms of transfer payments, as the economy starts to turn around and more people return to work, there will be fewer people that qualify for those government services like food stamps, unemployment, Medicaid. So we have fewer people who are receiving them, and therefore the amount of money spent in transfer payments will fall. Yet there was no conscious change in the amount of money being allocated towards those transfer payments. Both of these will result in potentially a surplus. The budget balance will increase. None of them were discretionary. They're all part of these automatic stabilizers. Because of automatic stabilizers, it becomes complicated to figure out how our budget is actually doing. Is there a surplus because the budget is balanced in that way and more revenue is coming in? Or is there a surplus because we happen to be in an expansionary period of the economy? Same thing with deficits. Do we have a deficit because we've spent more than we're taking in? Or do we have a deficit because we're in a recession, so revenues from taxes and transfers are automatically changing? It's very difficult to figure out how we're actually doing unless we break apart why is the budget balanced the way that it is. So we need to separate the impacts from discretionary changes in fiscal policy, which are long-term. And we're talking about things like if the government decides to increase government spending, if the government decides to cut taxes, they're going to actually change laws, change codes. Those things, once the changes have gone into effect, will stay in effect for years to come. And that's why they have longer term effects, because that change continues on. Whereas if we're in a deficit or a surplus simply because of the business cycle, that's shorter term. When the business cycle changes, that effect will stop. So that is a way for us to separate out to see how are we doing. So the goal of this cyclically adjusted business cycle and the cyclically adjusted budget balance rather is to figure out, would our budget be balanced if we weren't in a gap at all? If we're not in a recession, if we're not in inflation, are we actually spending the right amount? Are we taking in the right amount in revenue? Is what we're doing sustainable in the long run? Or are we making a mistake with one of those three things: taxes, transfers, and government spending? When we're separating long-term from shorter-term effects, we're going to end up with the cyclically adjusted budget balance. The first word, cyclically, tells us that we are adjusting for where we are in the business cycle, because the business cycle is going to affect the outcome. So if we adjust for the business cycle, we're removing the effect of recessions and inflationary gaps, and we're going to see what the budget balance would be if our real GDP were equal to our potential. If you recall our gaps, if we had a recessionary gap, we're making less than our potential. But if we're on the long run potential, if we're at full employment, we've removed any gaps and we're just seeing where we are currently. And that would help us figure out if our current spending levels are sustainable, or if we need to adjust tax revenues, spending levels in order to balance the budget. If we solve for the cyclically adjusted budget balance, and we adjust for the effects, we remove the effects of the business cycle, and we still have a deficit, that tells us that there is a mistake. Either our tax revenue isn't enough, or the amount of government spending or government transfers is too much. And we can see that whatever we're doing is not sustainable, and therefore we need to make a change. So now that we've seen that the budget balance does have impacts from the business cycle, would it be a good idea to require that local, state, and federal governments have a balanced budget annually or each year? The answer is no. Most economists don't think so. Think back to what we saw earlier, where if we intervene every time there's a deficit or a surplus, if you fix that problem, you create another one. So you could be worsening inflations and recessions with your actions. Let's go through and prove why, if we intervene in every single year to try to make the budget be balanced, it can actually be really bad for our economy at large. So first of all, what if the economy is in a recessionary gap? So we have our picture here showing the recessionary gap. During the recession, tax revenues fall because of, remember, the decrease in income tax and sales tax. And transfer payments rise because there's more people that are qualifying for unemployment, Medicaid, food stamps, welfare. So all of those things, we have a recession, and those automatic stabilizers are going to give us a deficit. Even though those are linked, they're two separate problems. One problem is in the business cycle, and one problem is in the budget balance. So let's see, what would we do to balance this deficit? To balance a deficit, we need our budget balance equation, right? So BB equals T taxes minus G government spending minus T transfer payments. So to get out of a deficit, our options are, if we increase taxes, that could get us out of the deficit, or if we decrease government spending, or if we decrease government transfers, any of those discretionary things would reduce the deficit. It could get us into a surplus. But how would those changes affect the recession? If you increase taxes, people are going to buy less stuff. AD would shift to the left. If you decrease government spending, the government's buying less stuff. AD would shift to the left. So see how either way, no matter which of those solutions you do, you actually worsen the recession. See how it's even further away from the long run potential? Our recessionary gap has increased. So if the law stated that you can't have a deficit, you must balance the budget each year, we could do that, but it would also make this recessionary gap deeper. That's not a good thing. Now, what if we're in an inflationary gap? So we can see our diagram is showing an inflationary gap. This can be created through automatic stabilizers because tax revenue tends to increase because income tax is higher, sales tax is higher, and then transfer payments go down because more people are working, they are doing better financially, they're not going to qualify for as many government services. So we have inflationary gap and a surplus. Now, inflationary gaps are an issue, and surpluses aren't really problems in the economy. But if your goal is to balance the budget, there will probably be some constituents that are complaining about a surplus. Why do we have a surplus? Does that mean you're making me pay too much in taxes? So there can always be that counter argument. So if the goal is to balance the budget and to get rid of the surplus, you could decrease taxes or increase government spending. And both of those would balance the budget, but let's see what they would do to our inflationary gap. If you decrease taxes, people have more disposable income and more money left over to spend, which would shift AD to the right. If you increase government spending, that has a direct effect on AD, and again, it would move to the right. So in both cases, our gap has worsened, our inflation has worsened, the inflationary gap is worse off. So you can balance the budget, but yet again, the gap's worse. So the business cycle would certainly take a hit if we insisted on balancing the budget every single year. Knowing that, economists don't think budget should be balanced every single year. They do think that it is good to have a balanced budget, but they'd rather it be on average. So, if in recessionary times you have deficits and expansionary times you have surpluses, on average, that balances out. And that way, the economy is able to move freely without constantly intervening. So it's better for our highs and our lows in the business cycle as well. The goal is to have the budget balanced on average. But in reality, many governments don't do that, and they have deficits year after year after year. So we're going to look at the long run effects when a government continuously has deficits. Usually, when this is a constant problem and governments are spending more than they receive in tax revenue, they're going to borrow to make up the funds. They still have bills to pay. So governments with these persistent deficits are going to end up with large national debts. People often get the terms debt and deficits confused because they're similar. Debt is cumulative. It is the accumulation of all of these previous years. So deficits are annual. So in this year, if we spent more than we took in, we had a deficit. If there was a deficit last year too, you would add those up together and come up with the debt. Now, it is possible that you could have deficit, 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 surplus, because each year you're going to have good years and bad years. But the total effect on that nation will be the nation's debt. Public debt is government debt held by individuals and institutions outside of the government. So if you own a savings bond, if you buy a treasury bond, if a bank is in possession of a treasury bond, or if a bank or a financial institution wants to loan the government money, all those things are going to be part of the public debt. Now, this website we're going to see, the U.S. debt debt.clock.org site is wonderful because it shows our current debt in real time. So I'll record it as it is now at the moment that I'm recording the video, but feel free to check this out and see how it compares to see if our debt is higher or lower than what you're seeing at this moment. So, as you can see, this is in real time. The numbers are actually moving as they go. If you hold the mouse over a certain number, you'll see a little text box that opens up that gives you more information about what that value is. So first of all, we have our national debt. When you're counting, we have hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions. So 19 trillion, 970 billion, and it goes on. So this is quite a large national debt. You can also see our deficit. Remember, debts are cumulative and deficits are annual. So you can see how much we are in the hole this year versus the total debt that we have. We can also see our revenues. Whenever you see an arrow, something going up, you can see that it's increased in the percentage. So our federal spending, our government spending is increasing, but our tax revenue is increasing too. So you can kind of see how these things all compare. They even broke our debt up per citizen versus per taxpayer, because there's a difference between people that are American citizens but might not be old enough to be paying taxes. So that's why these are different values. We can also see our GDP. This is going to be important later on in these notes because we're going to have to compare our debt to GDP ratio. GDP are all of the products, the goods and services that are produced in the economy. If we have a high GDP, that means we're producing goods and services that we can tax. We have the ability to tax those items. So the GDP kind of becomes a symbol of our ability to earn revenue through taxes. And the higher the GDP, the more of our debt we are potentially able to pay back. So when nations are being evaluated in terms of, is this a good country to loan money to, they're going to look at the debt to GDP ratio. So our GDP is a little bit lower than our national debt, but they are close. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at nations. We also can see, if we scroll down here, some of the stuff from previous units. We have the monetary base. That includes bank reserves and currency in circulation. We can see M2, all kinds of things that we've learned about throughout the year. You can even see at the bottom some of our entitlement programs and our liabilities. We're going to end these notes talking about these things, but I'll just show you what these are. So entitlement programs are things that we have promised people. So we have promised Social Security and Medicare and some of these federal pensions and things like that. So even if people aren't withdrawing money from these accounts yet, they've started paying in to their Social Security under the understanding that when they retire, they'll get this money back. So it's a liability because that money will be leaving our government. This is a huge chunk of money. So again, we have hundreds, thousands, millions, billions, trillions of dollars in liabilities in these things. So even if we decide to change some of our government spending and tax laws now, these liabilities, these entitlements are problematic because what do when you've promised someone money? Who doesn't get paid? The person that's retiring next week? The person that's retiring in 20 years? How do we handle such a big future liability? Here are two problems posed by nations that have persistent deficits and debt year after year. The first one we've seen before, this concept of crowding out. There is only a finite or limited amount of loanable funds available in the economy. Banks only have so much that they can loan out in their excess reserves. Governments are major borrowers in the loanable funds market. They can borrow in the millions of, not billions of dollars. So when they're borrowing such huge amounts of money, that crowds out or pushes out anyone else who needs to borrow money, like households or firms. Banks often choose to lend their money, their loanable funds, to the government because they know that these groups are not going to default on them. So they seem like a lower risk, so that limits the amount for everybody else in the economy. When households and firms are denied access to as much loanable funds, this is going to reduce consumer, but especially investment spending, which is going to be the biggest factor for our economy, because when the demand for loanable funds goes up, that's going to increase the real interest rate. But when investment spending goes down, if businesses aren't able to expand and grow, the long run rate of growth of our nation and our real GDP can be crippled. So not only are loans harder to get, but they're more expensive since you're paying a higher real interest rate, and the growth of the country can be affected. The second major issue when nations have deficits and debt is that if they have deficits over and over and over again, it can create financial pressure for the future. That these loans that the government takes out when they're borrowing have interest rates charged to them. And there's different terms of each loan, but sometimes this interest is compounding. Sometimes these interest rates are variable, which means they fluctuate, they go up and down with the economy. So not only are we paying this huge amount of debt, but we're paying interest on this debt. And all of that money takes away future dollars from future obligations. So even if we earn more in tax revenue in the future, a lot of that money is going to go to pay old debts, and it reduces our ability to pay for things that we might want to pay for in the future. Could be education, military, NASA, health advances, roads, whatever it is we want to spend our money on. This can have a crippling impact if we have really huge debt. And this can hurt future standards of living if a large amount of our current money is paying back old debt or interest payments on old debt. If a government realizes that they have been accumulating this debt and they want to pay it off, we're going to go through some of the bad ideas and good ideas for actually solving this problem. The point of doing bad ideas is that there actually have been quite a few nations that have done the bad ideas. So you can do any of these options, but some of them are certainly better than others. So one of the bad ways for a government to pay off the debt is through borrowing. If a government continues to take out more loans instead of reassessing their budget or changing something, making a discretionary change to their policies, they're just borrowing money to pay for the debt. That's like a person getting a new credit card to pay off an old credit card. And if you are a person, eventually that can lead to personal bankruptcy, where you're paying interest rates on top of interest rates, you're buying things you can't afford, and you're taking a large chunk of your income to pay off things in the past. It doesn't work well for people. It also doesn't work well for nations. And there have been quite a few countries that have declared bankruptcy when they just weren't able to pay back their debt. They'd accumulated so much debt that they had to declare bankruptcy. In practice, this can mean that the currency or the banking system or the government of that country can be negatively affected. It also affects the credit score of a nation, and countries do have credit scores. This will impact if other countries want to loan them money in the future. It also affects capital inflows, because remember, that's based on the perception of people in other nations about how safe and secure your country is. If your country has declared bankruptcy, then capital inflows into your nation will decline. That's going to hurt the supply of loanable funds, raise interest rates, and create some long-term problems in terms of getting out of this hole. Another bad idea that has been used by some countries to get rid of their debt is to simply print more money. So in America's case, the Federal Reserve creates money. They would print new money, and that could be used to pay down the debt of the Treasury. Thankfully, we haven't done this. In America, we keep our monetary policy and our Federal Reserve separate from the executive branches of the country. So the federal government can't make the Fed print money, and it keeps us from doing this. The problem is that in nations that do print money to pay off their debt, it gets rid of their debt, but it affects the value or purchasing power of your currency. And it can destroy the bank accounts, the savings, the nest eggs of people in your nation. You might have pleased this foreign lender by paying off the debt, but that meant that you created serious inflation, and the value of the money that all of your people hold just went way down. So that can be a serious problem. So what is a good idea, an actual solution? Well, the only good idea is a politically painful one. In order to get out of debt, you have to do something to fix the budget balance. Major categories are increasing taxes or cutting spending. You also could cut government transfers. Any of those three things would fix the budget, but all three of them are politically unpopular. So oftentimes we avoid the solutions and kind of keep on going business as usual. The fact that the credit score of our nation is as high as it is, capital inflows are high, people feel safe saving money in America, could be part of why we're putting off doing something about this debt. We'll see how far it goes before some of these more painful solutions have to go into effect. As mentioned before, the debt to GDP ratio is the major way that governments are assessed in terms of will they be able to pay their debt, or is it way out of control? So we look at government debt as a percentage of GDP. The lower it is, the better. But as long as the GDP is higher than the debt, that tells the world that this country has products that it continues to produce, that it can tax, and that potential revenue can help pay down the debt. So if people that are considering lending to a country think that it has a high ability to pay back the debt, they're more likely to get the loan. This is similar to viewing debt like a person. So if I wanted to give a $5,000 loan, and I'm comparing two people, one person makes $20,000 a year, one person makes $100,000 a year. The person who makes more money will have an easier time paying down that loan than somebody who doesn't. So you're comparing their ability to pay back the money to the debt. And that's kind of how debt to GDP ratios work for countries. The reason why the debt to GDP ratio is a better measure than just looking at debt is that GDP, which is economy-wide, shows us the potential amount of tax revenue that could be collected by the government. The government could always raise the tax rate on those goods and services if they wanted to, but it shows other countries how much is being produced in this nation that they could earn tax revenue on. What's really important, the key idea here, is that if the government's debt grows slower than GDP, the burden of paying the debt is actually falling. And burden is the idea that how hard is it to pay it back. So if our GDP is growing more than our debt, our ability to pay back this debt is getting easier and easier. The burden is falling. We're going to do an okay job paying this debt back. So the ratio of the debt to GDP can fall even when our debt is rising, as long as GDP is growing faster. So in most countries, the debt and the GDP are continuing to rise. But if the GDP is growing more than the debt, the ratio goes down because your ability to pay has increased. Here we can look at a trend of the debt to GDP ratio for America. And you can see that even though our current debt is higher than it's ever been, the debt to GDP ratio is not the highest. The highest that we had there was World War II, where we were spending a huge amount of money on military spending. And because so many people were, so many of the men were serving overseas that normally would be in our labor force, our GDP fell. Our ability to produce new goods and services fell. So that was the worst for our debt to GDP ratio. So you can look at debt in terms of total debt or in terms of debt to GDP ratio. These are going to give us different information. Also, our total debt would, of course, be higher now as inflation has gone on. So there's lots of things that can throw off how you look at debt overall. Implicit liabilities are the last part of the puzzle because we have current liabilities right now. So we're paying down some of our loans, we're paying interest on some of these loans. There are some citizens that are currently taking money out of Social Security and Medicare and things like that. But we have implicit liabilities, which are these future liabilities that we've already promised but haven't started paying yet in full. So think of all the people in America that have started making payments towards their Social Security, for example, but they haven't actually retired yet. So they haven't taken money out yet. At the same time, these are liabilities for the government because that money will be leaving. So all the money that people have paid into Social Security that they haven't yet taken out when they retire function as a debt for America because that money is not ours, and we have a huge amount of money that will be taken out of the accounts when especially the baby boomers start to retire. In the United States, some of these implicit liabilities are things like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They're often called entitlement programs because the people that have started paying into these things from when they began working consider themselves entitled to the benefits. I've been paying into this account, therefore I'm entitled to the money that comes from it. But this is a huge dollar amount for our economy. 40% of the federal spending is paying for these government transfer programs. So it's a huge chunk of our current budget. And it will only get bigger. So as our baby boomers age, as the average age of America in general goes up, we're going to have more and more people that are qualifying for these things. There will be more money coming out of those funds. And also, as the baby boomers retire, we actually will start for the first time to have more people taking money out of Social Security than putting money in, because the labor force, the number of people putting money into these accounts, will be smaller than those retired. So these are major issues. We currently have a large amount of debt in the trillions, but that is not actually showing us all of the money that we have promised for these entitlements. So this is one of the biggest problems, because even if we change future tax rates, future amounts of government spending and government transfers, what do we do with these current promises, the current obligations? All of the people that have started contributing to these funds have an expectation that they will receive those benefits. What do we do if the money isn't there? Who doesn't actually get paid? So these are going to be major issues that we're going to have to figure out that go along with solving our debt. The rest of these notes are going to be some review equations, some practice problems, some of which will bring us way back to the beginning of the year and some of the equations that we need. So the first one is about the nation of Foxlandia. They have a closed economy and there are no government transfers. So first of all, do you remember what closed economy means? Closed means no international trade. And then no government transfers, we know about that one. So we're given some information. We're given the GDP. C stands for consumer spending. G, government spending. And T, taxes, tax revenue. So the first question says, calculate the level of investment spending. With the information that you have, which equation would you need to give you the investment spending? The GDP equation will give us, because we know a few equations for investment spending. We know GDP, we know the saving investment identity, but we don't have savings here at all. So we have to use the GDP equation. That includes, this is the SIG XM. Now, which of these things were we given in this problem? We know the GDP, we know C, we're solving for I, and we know G. We don't know X minus IM, but the question said closed economy. X minus IM is about exports minus imports. That's about net exports. If it's a closed economy, there is no trade. Therefore, we have what we need to have. So GDP equals 1,500. Consumer spending is 1,000 plus government spending of 400 million gives us 1,400 million on the right side of the equation. 1,500 million on the left side of the equation. So 1,500 minus 1,400, you can solve for I. Go ahead and plug these things in. Now that we have I, investment spending, we're supposed to calculate the level of private savings. Which equation would give you that? Savings equals investment spending. So whatever you had as your last answer will give you the number for savings. And then for budget balance, which equation can we use for that? It's BB equals T minus G minus TR. Now in this case, we don't have transfers, but the question said that there are no transfers in the U.S. economy. So taxes, 300 million, minus government spending, 400 million, equals negative $100 million. So if we have a budget balance as a negative, is it a deficit or a surplus? It's a deficit, and the equation that we'll use is if budget balance is greater than 0, we have a surplus. If budget balance is less than 0, and in this case, negative $100 million is less than 0, we have a deficit. Now that we've reviewed those equations, let's do this one more time with slightly a more complicated economy. Dogtopia is a small nation with an open economy, meaning there will be trade, but there are still no government transfers. So to calculate the level of investment spending, we're going to use that GDP equation, but we have all of the pieces here. So we have C, G, X, we have M standing for imports in this case, and GDP. So go ahead and solve for it, and then we'll check your work. Should be $480 million. When you have investment spending, S equals I, so private savings will be equal to the same amount, 480 million. For budget balance, BB equals taxes minus government spending. We don't have transfers, so our budget balance is $100 million. Because it is a positive number, do we have a deficit or a surplus? We have a surplus. So make sure that you remember those equations and that you know how to use them.